honor to introduce Jason Riley, columnist, Wall Street Journal, and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Jason?
We got to live together.
Thank you, Ron, for that introduction, and also want to thank the Steamboat Institute for the opportunity to speak here today. I do a fair amount of speaking on college campuses, and as you heard in the previous panel discussion, that's been no fun lately. With all the talk of safe spaces and microaggressions and trigger warnings and all the other nonsense that parents today are paying $60,000 a year to subject their children to. So I appreciate this change of venue, frankly. And not to mention the chance for my wife and I to get out of the East right now, where the weather isn't quite so nice. It's also good to know that the services of a political pundit are still in demand after we got so much wrong in 2016. So I appreciate the Steamboat Institute's abiding faith in my profession. I just wanted to add that as well. I was asked to spend a few minutes talking about the theme that I explore in False Black Power, a book that I published last spring. It started out as a column, then grew into a longer essay, and eventually a short book. But my intention was to make a fairly simple point, which is that President Obama needed black voters much more than blacks needed him. Now, before all the Obama supporters in the audience today start jumping down my throat, let me explain what I mean by that. What I mean is that political activity is not the most effective method of advancing a group economically. A racial or ethnic group's political success does not automatically translate into economic success. One does not flow naturally from the other. It's hardly an original observation, but I think it's one that is regularly ignored by civil rights activists and others who practice what is sometimes today called identity politics, that is, urging blacks and other minorities to vote as a bloc, favor candidates of their own racial or ethnic background, and so forth. And I thought the end of the Obama presidency was an especially good time to re-examine this strategy, which has been in place for more than 50 years now. Since the 1960s, black leaders have really prioritized the integration of political institutions. And they've had a great deal of success in doing this. By the early 1980s, major US cities with large black populations, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Washington, Philadelphia, and so forth, had elected black mayors. By the early 1990s, more than 300 cities in America had black mayors. Since 1970, the number of black elected officials has grown from fewer than 1,500 to more than 10,000, including, of course, a black president. In addition, we saw a proliferation of black police chiefs and school superintendents and council members and state legislators. We've had racially gerrymandered voting districts created to ensure the election of blacks to Congress, and so forth. The problem is that all of this political clout really never paid off economically for the black poor, which is what we were told would happen. You look at how the black underclass fared in Coleman Young's Detroit in the 1970s, or Marion Barry's Washington, D.C. in the 1980s, or Sharp James's Newark, New Jersey in the 1990s. These black mayors created these unbeatable political machines in the name of helping the black poor, yet the poor became even more impoverished on their watch. Mississippi has long boasted more black officials than any other state, yet it continues to have one of the highest black poverty rates in the nation. There have been case studies of places like Atlanta in the 1970s and 80s, for example, where under black mayors, the city implemented racial preference policies for hiring black city workers and contractors. And sure enough, the number of black successful businesses increased. But average income blacks were left behind, and the black poor actually lost ground during this period. And that's been the story nationwide. In an era of increasing black political clout, not to mention affirmative action and racial set-asides, the black underclass has lost ground, not only in absolute terms, but relative to the white underclass. In the 1970s and 80s, and even into the 90s, the poorest blacks in America saw their incomes decline at more than double the rate of comparable whites. Again, in an era of racial preferences for blacks, in an era of set-asides for blacks, and in an era of unprecedented growth in the number of black elected officials in this country, the black poor have regressed. Their situation has worsened. Yes, gains have been made for blacks, by blacks over the decades. On balance, blacks are certainly better off than they were 50 years ago. But the track record regarding the black poor is appalling. It's clear that government programs, whether they are implemented by black or white politicians, aren't the solution for many of the problems that these blacks face. It's clear that the Great Society government programs in the 1960s may have been well-intentioned, but aren't getting the job done. And the question is why? What's going on? The short answer, judging from history, is that blacks ultimately must help themselves. These problems aren't necessarily political and won't necessarily lead themselves to political solutions, regardless of the color of the politician or public policymaker. Ultimately, blacks will have to do what other groups have done, develop the same attitudes and habits and behaviors that other groups developed in order to rise in America. And to the extent that a government policy, however well-intentioned, interferes with this necessary self-development, can do more harm than good. History shows that there aren't any shortcuts. History shows that open-ended welfare benefits do not help people develop a work ethic, which is ultimately what they must develop in order to rise out of poverty and stay out of poverty. History shows that increasing the minimum wage will increase the cost of hiring younger, less experienced workers, many of whom are black. So fewer blacks will wind up getting that first job and the experience that comes with it. History shows that soft-on-crime laws make ghettos more dangerous for the mostly law-abiding residents who live there, and make life easier for the criminals who, of course, primarily prey on poor blacks. History shows that racial preferences in college admissions mismatch students with schools, which result in lower black graduation rates and fewer black professionals than we would have in the absence of these policies, and so on. Yet we continue to ignore the historical record. These kinds of policies continue to be pushed in the name of helping blacks, and the people who promote these policies don't seem particularly interested in reevaluating some very basic assumptions. But I think this history should have tempered the expectations for the first black president, without taking away anything from Obama's historic accomplishment, or the country's widespread sense of pride in the racial progress that his election symbolized. The reality is that there was little reason to believe that a black president was the answer to racial inequities or the problems of the black poor. And sure enough, black-white gaps in household income, poverty, home ownership, and other measures all widened under Obama. The job situation for blacks did improve toward the end of his second term. But blacks did not see their average unemployment rate fall below double digits until the third month of Obama's 7th year in office. So now we have more evidence that the proliferation of black politicians in recent decades, which now includes a twice-elected black president, has done little to narrow racial gaps in employment, income, home ownership, academic achievement, and other areas. Now, this is not to say that blacks should not run for office or engage politically. I'm not saying that. What I'm questioning is whether gaining political influence should continue to play such a central role in efforts to help blacks advance, or whether black leaders and others interested in addressing racial inequities would do better to focus their attention elsewhere. Nor am I suggesting that the Obama presidency caused these gaps to widen. History shows that racial inequity has widened under white mayors and white governors and white presidents as well. What I'm suggesting is that the belief that a black president would make a huge difference in racial inequality was misplaced. It may seem counterintuitive, but the reality is that most minority groups in America that have risen economically have done so with little or no political influence. And groups that have enjoyed early political success have tended to rise to prosperity more slowly. You can look at the experience of Germans, or the experience of Jews, or the experience of Italians and Asians, all of whom saw economic gains precede political gains in America. Nor is this something unique to the experience of minority groups in America. The ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, the English in Argentina, Jews in Britain, among many other examples, all prospered economically while mostly shunning politics. Historically, even if a group had the ability to wield political influence, it didn't always choose to do so. German immigrants to the US in colonial times were not lacking in numbers. In Pennsylvania, they were a third of the population, a situation that was not lost on non-Germans in Pennsylvania. Way back in the 1750s, Benjamin Franklin was complaining about German immigrants to Pennsylvania. He wrote, "Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly become so numerous as to Germanize us instead of us Anglifying them?" Nevertheless, Germans, many of whom arrived as indentured servants and focused initially on paying off the cost of their voyage, had other priorities and were well known for avoiding politics. Germans began entering politics only after they had prospered economically in the US and elsewhere where Germans settled. A counterexample, and the example that blacks probably have most closely followed, is the Irish, whose rise from poverty was especially slow, even though Irish-run political organizations in places like Boston and Philadelphia dominated local government. The Irish had more political success in the US than any other ethnic group historically. Yet the Irish were the slowest rising of all European immigrants to America. The political power of Irish elected officials had little impact on the economic progress of most Irish people. In fact, it wasn't until we saw the decline of the influence of those political machines that you saw the Irish middle class began to really swell in the US, to the point where today, of course, Irish incomes and home ownership rates and levels of education all far exceed the national average. So viewed against this history, many people were expecting Obama's presidency to deliver more prosperity for blacks than political clout tends to deliver for a group in the US or anywhere else. Now, the black experience in America is, of course, very different from the Irish experience, which in turn is different from the Chinese or German or Jewish experience. In fact, we can't even generalize about all blacks in the US, since the experience of black natives is going to be different from the experience of black immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa. But that doesn't mean group cultural traits that show patterns of success or failure should be completely ignored. Just because we can't make perfect apples-to-apples comparisons doesn't mean we can't take note and learn from certain patterns that repeat themselves again and again. The reality is that many different racial and ethnic minority groups have experienced various degrees of hardship in the US and other countries, all over the world. How those groups have dealt with those circumstances is something to study closely and draw lessons from, even if the only lesson is to manage our expectations. But one of the clearest patterns we see from this history is that human capital, and by that I mean the collective skills and knowledge that create economic value, human capital, has proven to be far more important than political capital and getting ahead. A racial or ethnic group's culture, its attitudes, its habits, its values matter more, much more, than electing people who look like them. And that reality helps explain why blacks fared the way they did, not only in the Obama era, but also in preceding decades. If you don't like comparisons between blacks and immigrants, another way to look at it is to compare blacks today with blacks of a previous era. Prior to the 1960s, in the first half of the 20th century, when blacks were more focused on developing this human capital, we saw racial gaps narrowing in income, narrowing in educational attainment, narrowing in black representation in skilled professions and elsewhere. Blacks were not only making gains in absolute terms, they were gaining on whites. Yet in the wake of the Great Society welfare state expansions of the 1960s, and in wake of the black leadership's decision, conscious decision, to shift much of their focus to attaining political power, that previous progress slowed down or stalled, or in some cases even reversed course. Let me offer some examples. For most of the first half of the 20th century, up until 1940, black marriage rates in the US were higher than white marriage rates. In the 1940s and 1950s, black labor participation rates exceeded those of whites. Black incomes grew at much faster rates than white incomes, and the black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points. Between 1940 and 1970, so this is during Jim Crow and prior to the era of affirmative action, the number of blacks in middle-class professions in America quadrupled. Between 1950 and 1960, in New York City alone, the number of black accountants increased by more than 200%. The number of engineers and teachers and social workers grew by more than 100%. Even doctors and lawyers saw their ranks swell among blacks by more than 50%. In other words, racial gaps were not just narrowing, but narrowing in some cases quite rapidly. Steady progress was being made. It was being made during a time of rampant racism. It was being made when blacks had very little political clout. It was being made when the US government was at best indifferent to their well-being. Blacks were making progress because the focus was on developing human capital, which is far more important than electing black politicians. As I said earlier, Obama needed black voters to win the White House. But the idea that black Americans need a black president to prosper in this country is not something supported by the historical record. Blacks today hear plenty about what they can't achieve due to racism and the legacy of slavery, and not enough about what they did in fact achieve, notwithstanding hundreds of years of bondage, followed by decades of legal segregation and little political influence. I think what's too often missing from most of today's discussions about racial inequality, and that's whether we're talking about employment or education or incarceration, income or other measures, is the role that culture plays. Discussing antisocial behavior in poor black communities and suggesting that such behavior plays a significant role in racial inequality has become almost taboo. In most discussions, the focus is on what other people should be doing to help blacks instead of what blacks must do to help themselves. Let me use a personal anecdote to elaborate on this. A few years ago, I wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal on the prevalence of violent crime in poor black neighborhoods. And in the column, I used a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who once told a black congregation, "Do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population of St. Louis and responsible for 58% of the crimes?" He said, "We've got to face that. We've got to do something about our moral standards." He said, "We know that there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves." Now, after the column ran, a number of readers contacted the paper and accused me of making up the quote, which comes from a 1961 profile of King written by James Baldwin in Harper's Magazine. I was a little surprised by this reaction, because all you have to do is Google the quote to find the source. But what really struck me about the accusation is that those making it apparently just couldn't believe that the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders used to speak this way about problems in the black community and the role of personal responsibility. Now, King was obviously a uniquely gifted and capable leader, and I'm not suggesting that black people today need another King. They don't. What I'm suggesting is that King represented a type of leadership, a type of thinking, a good faith approach to closing racial divisions that politicians and social activists today barely even give lip service to. King and his generation of leaders, people like Thurgood Marshall and Roy Wilkins, who was head of the NAACP during the 1950s and 60s, they believed that whites obviously had a role to play in changing a fundamentally racist system. But they also understood that blacks had a role to play. And they were willing to hold blacks accountable, despite the white racism, the legal and rampant white racism that existed at the time. They operated under belief and tried to instill in young people the belief that blacks must succeed notwithstanding these racial barriers, that blacks can't simply sit around and wait for whites to get their act together first, that there's no time for that. Again, as King put it, we can't keep blaming white people for our problems. There are things we must do for ourselves. By contrast, many activists and politicians today who express concern about the plight of the black underclass spend much more time making excuses for the kind of antisocial behavior that prominent black leaders of the King era regularly condemned. This contemporary leadership doesn't really want to discuss black behavior. They want to discuss white behavior. The assumption is that black behavior is almost irrelevant. They send young black kids out into the world with a chip on their shoulder. They tell them the cops are gunning for them. Teachers are racist. Tests are racist. Employers are racist. Judges and prosecutors, entire criminal justice system is racist, stacked against them. And they tell them that the world owes them, and that if they don't succeed, it's not their fault. So at a time when young blacks today are far more likely to experience racial preferences than racial slights, at a time when you have a generation of young people who came of age with a twice-elected black president, we have people in positions of influence and authority insisting that blacks can't be held in any way responsible for these persistent racial gaps until white racism has been vanquished from America. In many cases today, you're dealing with a black leadership that considers any focus at all on black responsibility and accountability to be itself a form of racism. And you're dealing with an academic and political and media environment that, for the most part, takes the side of these black leaders. The discussion of race and crime today is a perfect example of this phenomenon. In the media, on college campuses, among civil rights activists, political figures, even in the world of sports, a fundamentally dishonest narrative has taken hold. The press, my profession, is very eager to break down police shootings by race, but hesitant to break down criminal behavior by race, which gives the public a distorted picture, a very distorted picture of what's happening. Study after study after study, going back decades, has shown that blacks are arrested and incarcerated at higher rates than whites based on behavior. That doesn't mean there are no racist cops or cops who abuse their authority, but it's clear that racism in and of itself is an inadequate explanation for higher rates of arrest and incarceration among blacks. There's no complete national database on police shootings. Some police departments report more extensive data than others, and perhaps some uniform system should be put in place. I certainly wouldn't object to that. But the data we do have show that in a typical year, police are involved in approximately 2 or 3% of black shooting deaths in this country. In the first half of 2016, for example, there were about 2,100 shootings in Chicago. Out of those 2,100, just 9 involved police. Over the course of the entire year, there were more than 4,300 shootings in Chicago. Almost all of the shooting victims were black, and 99.5% of the shootings were carried out by civilians, not cops. As my Manhattan Institute colleague Heather McDonald has reported, in the first 6 months of 2018, this year, more than 60 children under the age of 15 have been shot in Chicago. In June alone, an 11-year-old boy was shot in the head. A 12-year-old girl was killed as she was carrying her baby cousin. A 14-year-old boy was gunned down in a drive-by shooting. None of these shootings involve police, which is why the activist groups like Black Lives Matter have nothing much to say about them. Last weekend in Chicago, 74 people were shot between 3 p.m. on Friday and 6 a.m. on Monday. 74 people. One of the local hospital emergency rooms had to shut down because there were too many bodies. Again, none of these shootings involve police. None. Obviously, young black men in Chicago don't leave home each day in fear of getting shot by cops. But you'd never know that based on reading the media coverage. In New York, which has the nation's largest population and largest police force, the city has kept detailed records on police use of lethal force since 1971. That year, 1971, police shot 314 people, 93 of them fatally. 2 decades later, in 1991, the number of police shootings had fallen in New York from 314 to 108, and fatalities had fallen from 93 to 27. By 2015, the number of people shot by New York City cops had fallen to 23, with 8 fatalities. So we're talking about a reduction in police shootings and police shooting fatalities of more than 90% over the previous 4.5 decades in the nation's largest city with the nation's largest police force. And the story is similar in other major cities throughout the country. Police shootings have fallen dramatically in recent decades. Last year in Chicago, police shot 25 people, which represented just over 0.5% of all shootings in Chicago last year. According to figures from the Centers for Disease Control, police shootings of black people have fallen by more than 70% nationwide since 1970. The evidence shows that police today are less likely, much less likely, to use their weapons than they were in the past, especially with regard to dealing with black suspects. This idea of trigger-happy cops out there today systematically gunning for black men, based on everything we know, is a myth. Yet we have entire movements advancing this narrative, and the press expressing basically no skepticism about it. We have pro-athletes refusing to stand for the national anthem in protest of cops targeting young black men. They think there's some epidemic going on out there. It's a narrative that has gained tremendous currency based on anecdotal evidence, social media videos that have gone viral, but no empirical data supports this. We've reached a point where the facts don't really matter. All that matters is controlling the narrative. The media would have you believe that the main problem in our inner cities is policing. The sad reality is that blacks are about 13% of the population in this country, but commit more than half of all murders. Roughly 7,000 blacks are murdered each year, and 90% of them are killed by their peers. That is the epidemic. In New York, which is one of the safer big cities in the US, blacks are about 23% of the population, but commit 75% of all shootings and 70% of all robberies. Whites are 34% of New York's population, but commit less than 2% of the shootings and 4% of the robberies. And this isn't a New York phenomenon. You'll find similar numbers in Detroit, in Cleveland, in Philadelphia, in Boston, and Baltimore, and other large cities across the country. In fact, homicide is the leading cause of death for young black men in the US. And it's not because cops are killing them. Bad cops should be called out and punished. And I think the activists are performing a public service when they call attention to police misconduct. The problem, in my view, is the overemphasis on police behavior. If you believe that these lives really matter, if you want to reduce that black body count, as a practical matter, should your main focus be the 2% of black shooting deaths that involve cops, or the 98% that don't? Again, we want to talk about cops or racism or drug laws or poverty, anything to avoid talking about crime rates, talking about behavior. But on some level, the policing in these neighborhoods is not a cause, it's an effect. We can't pretend that there aren't legitimate reasons why black ghettos draw police attention. The cops are there because that is where the 9/11 calls originate. And tension between police and these communities is likely to continue so long as the high crime rates continue. This national discussion about race and crime is important because the violence that is so prevalent in these neighborhoods has enormous social and economic consequences as well. And it ought to be part of any serious discussion at what's driving racial inequality in this country. The common assumption is that poverty causes crime, but the truth is closer to the reverse of that. Businesses flee crime-ridden neighborhoods. Jobs follow. Property values fall. One reason that blacks are progressing at a much faster rate in the first half of the 20th century, when black political power was minimal and racism was legal and widespread, is that black communities back then were much less violent. The level of social pathology we see in black ghettos today is an anomaly. Things haven't always been this bad. Here's William Julius Wilson, the black sociologist, describing Harlem and other poor black neighborhoods in the 1940s and 50s. Wilson says that despite the high rate of poverty in ghetto neighborhoods throughout the first half of the 20th century, the rates of inner-city joblessness, teenage pregnancy, out-of-wedlock births, female-headed families, welfare dependency, and serious crime were significantly lower than in earlier years, and did not reach catastrophic proportions until the mid-1970s. He writes, "There was crime, but it did not reach the point where people were fearful of walking the streets at night. despite the overwhelming poverty. There was joblessness, but it was nowhere near the proportions of unemployment and labor force non-participation that have gripped ghetto communities since 1970. There were single-parent families, but they were a small minority of all black families and tended to be incorporated within extended family networks and to be headed not by unwed teenagers and young adult women, but by middle-aged women who were usually widowed, separated, or divorced. Wilson writes that there were welfare recipients, but only a very small percentage of families could be said to be welfare dependent. In short, he writes, unlike the present period, inner city communities prior to 1960 exhibited the features of social organization, sense of community, positive neighborhood identification, and explicit norms and sanctions against aberrant behavior. In other words, blacks living under Jim Crow conditions and only a couple generations out of slavery had more stable families and lived in safer communities than blacks living under a twice-elected black president, which I think is a remarkable statement to be able to make. Let me close by saying this. Shielding people from any responsibility for their situation today may seem like the kind or sympathetic thing to do, particularly in light of all the atrocities that blacks have endured in the United States over the centuries, and in light of the racism that continues to exist today. But the relevant question is whether it's helpful. More than anything else, the black underclass needs human capital. It needs the values, habits, attitudes, behaviors that facilitate economic advancement, regardless of who gets elected. A previous generation of black leaders understood this, and unprecedented black progress was the result. Let's hope this history informs our debates about racial inequality today and going forward. Thank you. Thank you. I think, thank you. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions that some people have written down here. Let's see here. One says, in an era of disinformation in the media, how do we formulate our opinions and discuss what's true? I would suggest you read the Wall Street Journal every day. Solid source of information. No, but it is it's a serious question. It's become a serious issue. And the press has really done itself no favors, I think, particularly since the election, in really blurring the difference between advocacy and activism and journalism. And this has been, I'm an opinion journalist. I'm paid to offer my opinions, and I consider my job to make sure that they're informed opinions, but they are opinions. People are turning, either watching me on television or reading my work to find out my opinion of things. But your White House correspondents, your people who cover politics in Washington or the State House, they're not supposed to be doing what I'm doing. And it doesn't seem to matter anymore. Those sort of barriers that were in place, admittedly, they've been blurring for a long time, but I think the election really changed things significantly for the worse. And the media really has not done a very good job of handling what happened. I joked earlier about even the opinion journalists getting things wrong in 2016. And I would think, and you would think, that the media would have spent the past 2 years trying to figure out how things went wrong and why things didn't turn out the way they anticipated. And in fact, no, it's turned into this sort of resistance They've joined the activists. Journalists have joined the activists. And the thinking is our job is to bring down this president. And that leaves people, readers, audiences, listeners, and viewers saying, where do I go? I'll make up my own mind. Where do I go to just find out what is going on, to get an accurate take on what is going on so that I can make up my own mind about what to think about this or that. So it is a serious problem, and I think the media has its work cut out in terms of regaining trust. Now, we were never held in the highest regard in terms of trustworthiness, but things have gone sideways in a serious way in the past couple years. Let's see here. I got a couple of the same questions here, I guess. How potent a force do you think racism against blacks is in America in 2018? Not very potent. But racism remains a potent political weapon. So whether or not it remains a huge barrier to black progress is almost a secondary concern to people who are out there shouting racism left or right. For them, it's a way to scare people to the polls, turn out candidates, raise money, raise your profile, and so forth. So the left loves to talk about longing for a post-racial America. Don't believe it for a second. They have no interest at all in a post-racial America. If you want a post-racial America, you do not support racially gerrymandered voting districts and racial preferences in college admissions. They do not want a post-racial America. They want to keep race front and center because they think that this identity politics is a very useful tool in advancing their candidates politically. But as a practical matter, no, I don't believe that racism is a barrier to black advancement. I don't believe it's been vanquished from the land, but I don't believe that it is stopping blacks from getting ahead in this country, and certainly not the way it once was able to. You talk about, I talked about Chicago. You know, the Ku Klux Klan is not driving through the south side of Chicago shooting the place up. That's not what is going on here. But again, to some people in positions of power, keeping blacks and other minority groups in a certain mindset, thinking of themselves as victims, helps their cause, helps them advance themselves. So an organization like the NAACP or Black Lives Matter is going to continue to pretend that racism is the main barrier to black advancement because that narrative helps the NAACP and helps Black Lives Matter. Whether it helps the people who they claim to speak on behalf of is a secondary concern to them. I think I'll stop there unless there's anything else. Thank you. Thank you very much.